Have you ever noticed that forests should grow randomly, but sometimes they don't? My name is Dana Whitlock. I'm a forest technician with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. For the past 5 years, I've worked in the Boreal forest region of northwestern Ontario, about 400 kilometers north of Thunder Bay. My job is straightforward on paper: monitor forest health, document growth patterns, assess timber stands, track wildlife corridors, mark areas for sustainable harvesting. Standard forestry work in one of the largest remaining tracts of unmanaged wilderness in southern Canada. Most people think forestry is just counting trees and measuring diameters. They don't understand that working alone in millions of hectares of boreal forest means you become intimately familiar with how nature behaves, how trees grow, how forests develop, and more importantly, how to recognize when something is growing in ways that violate every principle of forest ecology you've ever learned. If you stay until the end, I'll tell you about the circles, not fairy rings or natural clearings. The other circles, the ones that appear in mature forests where trees have grown for decades in perfect geometric patterns that shouldn't exist. Patterns that expand each year. Patterns that previous technicians documented but never explained. Because in the boreal forest of northwestern Ontario, there are places where the trees grow in ways that make no biological sense. And if you work here long enough, you learn that some patterns aren't natural growth. There's something else. Something that's been happening for longer than forestry records exist. And the protocols we follow, the unwritten ones that get passed from technician to technician, exist because people who ignored the patterns either left immediately or never came back from their surveys at all. I grew up in Sault Ste. Marie. My father was a mill worker. My mother taught biology at the community college. I spent my childhood in the bush, hiking, camping, learning to identify trees by bark and leaf. After high school, I studied forestry at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay. I wanted to work outdoors. I wanted a career that meant something beyond an office. The ministry was hiring. Northern Ontario needed technicians willing to work remote postings. The pay was good. The work was meaningful. And I'd be doing what I loved, spending time in the forest. My territory covers approximately 8,000 square kilometers of mixed boreal forest. Black spruce, jack pine, trembling aspen, white birch, tamarack in the wetlands. It's not old growth. Most of it regenerated after logging or fire in the past 60 to 80 years. But it's mature enough to show established patterns. My job is to survey designated areas, mark plot locations, take measurements, collect data on species composition, tree density, and growth rates. I work alone most of the time. The nearest town is a 2-hour drive. The nearest colleague is based 300 kilometers south. I have a truck, a GPS satellite phone, all the equipment I need. And for 8 months of the year, I'm essentially by myself in the bush, following transect lines and documenting what I find. The work is solitary but not lonely. You learn to appreciate the silence, the way light filters through the canopy, the sound of wind in the pines, the tracks of animals crossing your path. It's peaceful, meditative almost, but it's also work that requires attention to detail. You notice things, small changes, patterns. And after 5 years, I've developed an instinct for what belongs and what doesn't, what's normal growth and what's wrong. When I first started, my supervisor gave me standard training, forest survey protocols, safety procedures, wildlife awareness, standard ministry orientation. But during my second week, he also gave me something else. A folder, not official, just photocopied pages and handwritten notes. This is from previous texts, he said, not part of the manual, but you should read it, especially if you're going to work the northern sections alone. The folder contained observations, dated entries going back to the 1970s when the ministry first started systematic surveys in this region. Most were routine, notes about difficult terrain, good camping spots, areas with heavy bear activity. But scattered throughout were other entries, marked with asterisks, highlighted. These entries described something else: circular growth patterns, trees growing in perfect rings, expanding annually, always in remote areas, always in locations that technicians noted as requiring caution or recommend survey with partner, or do not camp near circles. I dismissed it at first, thought it was some inside joke, hazing the new technician with stories about weird forest phenomena. But my supervisor wasn't joking. "You'll see them eventually," he said. "Everyone does. When you do, document the location. Mark it in the database. But don't stay in the area after dark. Don't set up camp inside or near the circles. And if you find new circles forming, trees that are clearly young but already growing in geometric patterns, report it immediately and avoid that area for the rest of the season." "Why? What happens?" He didn't answer directly, just said, 3 technicians have quit after encountering the circles. 2 requested immediate transfer out of the region, and one disappeared during a survey in 2009. We found his truck and equipment. His GPS showed he'd been working a normal transect, but he never came back. Search and rescue spent 2 weeks looking. Found nothing. His last radio check-in mentioned he'd found an unusual growth pattern and was going to document it. That was the last anyone heard from him. I started my surveys in May. Spring in the Boreal forest. The snow had melted. The black flies were terrible. But the forest was waking up. Fresh growth. Birds returning. The season when you could cover the most ground before summer heat and before fall storms. I followed my assigned transects, measured plot data, collected samples, normal forestry work. The forest was exactly what I expected. Random, chaotic, trees growing where seeds had landed, competition for light creating natural gaps and dense patches. Normal ecology. Then in late June, during a survey about 70 kilometers from the nearest logging road, I found the first circle. I'd been following a transect line through mature black spruce when I noticed something ahead. A clearing, but not natural. The trees formed a perfect ring, maybe 30 meters in diameter. Inside the ring, the ground was clear. No undergrowth, no deadfall, just moss and bare mineral soil. The trees forming the ring were all black spruce, all approximately the same age, maybe 40 years old based on diameter, all growing straight, all perfectly spaced, all leaning inward slightly, like they were reaching toward the center of the circle. I'd seen natural patterns before. Lightning strikes creating circular regeneration, root rot causing trees to die in expanding rings. But this was different. The spacing was too perfect. The ages are too uniform. And the way they leaned inward wasn't wind damage or soil creep. It was a growth pattern, like something in the center was pulling them, or like they were deliberately arranged. I marked the location on my GPS. I took photographs, measured diameters, documented species and spacing. Then I checked the folder from my supervisor, found entries describing similar circles, different locations, different years, but the same pattern. Always black spruce, always mature trees, always perfectly spaced. One entry from 1983 noted, circle patterns appear to expand annually. Trees on the perimeter die back while new growth inside establishes in the same geometric spacing. Mechanism unknown. Recommend documentation but avoid prolonged exposure. I spent maybe 40 minutes at that first circle, taking measurements, trying to understand what would cause trees to grow like this. Then I noticed something else. The light was wrong. Inside the circle, it was dimmer than it should be. Not shaded, the canopy wasn't dense enough for that. Just darker. Like the sunlight wasn't reaching the ground as effectively. And it was quiet. No birds. No insects. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. Your own heartbeat. The kind that tells you something is wrong even if you can't articulate what. I finished my documentation, left the circle, continued my transect, but I couldn't stop thinking about it, about how unnatural it was, about what would cause such a perfect pattern, and about why the folder specifically warned against staying after dark. What happened after dark that made it dangerous? What had the disappeared technician seen that made him stop responding to radio calls? That night, back at my camp 15 kilometers away, I reviewed the photos. The circle looked even stranger in images. The geometric perfection was obvious, undeniable. This wasn't natural growth. This was something else. Something that had been creating the same pattern for decades at least. And according to the entries in the folder, the circles were appearing more frequently, expanding in size. And technicians who studied them too closely either left the profession or disappeared. Tomorrow I'd radio my supervisor, report the find, and learn whether the warnings in the folder were real or just stories meant to spook new employees. Because if they were real, if the circles were actually dangerous, then I needed to know why. I needed to understand what I was documenting, what I was working around, and what had happened to the technician who disappeared after saying he'd found an unusual growth pattern. Because in the Boreal forest of northwestern Ontario, where I worked alone in millions of hectares of wilderness, I was starting to understand that the trees didn't just grow randomly. Sometimes they grew in circles, perfect circles. And those circles had been appearing for decades, and people who studied them too long didn't come back. And I just spent 40 minutes inside one, taking measurements, completely unaware of whatever protocols I might have already violated. I radioed my supervisor the next morning, described the circle, gave coordinates. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "Did you stay inside it? For how long?" "Maybe 40 minutes. Just taking measurements and photos." Another pause. "And you left before dark?" "Yes. Set up camp 15 kilometers away." "Good. That's good." He sounded relieved. "Listen, Dana. What you found is documented. We have maybe 30 known circle locations in your territory. They're real. They're unexplained. And they're active. I need you to log it in the database. Mark it as a circle site. Then avoid that area for the rest of the season." Active? What does that mean? It means they change, expand. We've had technicians monitor them over multiple years. The circles grow outward, about 2 meters per year. The trees on the perimeter die. New trees establish inside the cleared area in the same geometric pattern. It's like the circle is alive, like it's growing. That's not possible. Trees don't coordinate growth like that. I know, but they do it anyway. And here's what you need to understand. The circles affect people. Technicians who spend too much time near them report effects, disorientation, time distortion, hearing things. The disappeared technician in 2009? His GPS log showed he'd been at a circle for 6 hours. But his watch showed only 90 minutes had passed. Time doesn't work right inside the circles. And people who stay too long don't come back the same. He gave me protocols. Official ones this time. Not just notes in a folder. If I encountered a circle, document location, take photos from outside the perimeter, Measure diameter from at least 10 meters back, log it, and leave within 30 minutes maximum. Never enter after 4 p.m. Never camp within 5 kilometers. Never return to the same circle more than once per season. And most importantly, if I found a new circle forming, one with young trees already arranged in geometric patterns, report it immediately and evacuate the area. Over the next month, I found 4 more circles. Different locations, different sizes, but the same pattern. Perfect geometric spacing. Black spruce leaning inward. Cleared centers. Dim light. Oppressive silence. Each time I followed protocols. Quick documentation. No lingering. Away before dark. But I also started noticing other things. The circles weren't random. They formed a pattern across my territory. When I plotted them on a map, they created a line, almost perfectly straight, running northeast to southwest across 80 kilometers of forest. And the line was pointing toward an area I hadn't surveyed yet. An area marked in my supervisor's folder with a red asterisk and a note. Primary site. Do not survey alone multiple historical incidents. In late July, I found something that made me understand why the protocols existed. I was surveying a new area, about 60 kilometers from the nearest circle I documented, following a transect through mixed forest. The terrain was rough, lots of deadfall, dense understory, slow going. Around 2 p.m., I entered a clearing, not a circle, just a natural gap where an old blowdown had created open space. But in the middle of the gap, I found evidence. Old equipment, a weathered backpack, a GPS unit in a cracked plastic case, and a field notebook in a waterproof bag. The notebook belonged to James McKay. The technician disappeared in 2009. His name was on the cover. His handwriting filled the pages. Standard survey notes at first. Tree measurements. Species lists. Plot data. But the final entries were different. Disturbed. The handwriting became erratic. The last pages described a circle he'd found. Described how he'd been documenting it for hours. How the light had changed. How he'd heard sounds like trees creaking but rhythmic, purposeful. How the circle had seemed to pulse. How he'd realized too late that he'd been inside it much longer than he thought. The final entry, barely legible, said, "The trees are moving. Not wind. Moving. The circle is closing. I need to," and then it stopped. Mid-sentence. Like he'd been interrupted. I stood in that clearing holding his notebook, realizing that he'd died here. Or disappeared. Or something. 14 years ago. And no one had found his body, just his equipment, left in a gap in the forest like he'd simply vanished. I marked the location, collected his belongings, hiked back to my truck. That night, I called my supervisor from the satellite phone, told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a long time. "We'll recover the remains if there are any," he said. "But Dana, you need to understand something. James violated protocols. He stayed too long. He documented the same circle multiple days in a row. He became obsessed with understanding them. And the forest, the circles, they don't tolerate that kind of attention." "What are you saying?" "That the trees killed him." "I'm saying that James disappeared inside a circle. That his equipment was found 8 kilometers from where his GPS said he should have been. That search and rescue found no tracks, no trail, no indication of how he'd moved from one location to another. Like he'd been transported. And I'm saying that you need to follow the protocols exactly, or you'll end up like James." In August, my supervisor sent me updated protocols. Official ministry documents this time, though marked internal use only, not for public distribution. The protocols were specific. Protocol 1. Never spend more than 30 minutes inside or within 10 meters of a circle perimeter. Document quickly and leave. Protocol 2. Never visit a circle after 4 p.m. or before 8 a.m. Circles are most active during low light periods. Protocol 3. Never return to the same circle within a 2-week period. Repeated exposure increases risk. Protocol 4. If you hear sounds inside a circle, creaking, movement, rhythmic patterns, leave immediately. Protocol 5. If you experience time distortion, disorientation, or visual disturbances near a circle, mark your position and evacuate. Do not attempt to continue survey work. Protocol 6. Never, under any circumstances, camp or remain overnight within 5 kilometers of a documented circle. Protocol 7. If you find trees beginning to grow in geometric patterns, particularly young trees in otherwise random forest, this indicates a new circle forming. Document location and do not return. Each protocol had incident reports attached. Technicians who'd violated them. Some quit. Some transferred. One had a psychological breakdown and was hospitalized for 3 months. She'd spent 4 hours inside a large circle taking detailed measurements. When she'd finally left, her watch showed 4:30 p.m. But her truck's clock and GPS both showed 11:47 p.m. 7 hours unaccounted for. She couldn't explain where the time had gone. Couldn't remember anything except the sound of trees moving and a feeling of being watched. The reports went back to 1974 when the ministry first began systematic documentation. Over 48 years, there had been 17 significant incidents related to circles. The disappeared technician James was the most severe, but others had experienced lasting effects. Memory loss, spatial disorientation, persistent anxiety about forest work. 3 had quit forestry entirely. 1 still worked for the ministry but refused any assignment in northwestern Ontario. I followed the protocols exactly, but I also kept finding new circles. By September, I documented 12 in my territory. All followed the same pattern. All were active, showing signs of annual expansion. And all were located along that same northeast-southwest line I'd noticed earlier. The line was pointing somewhere. To something. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the primary site my supervisor had marked, the one I wasn't supposed to survey alone, was at the end of that line. In late September, I found a forming circle. I was surveying an area that had regenerated after a fire 30 years ago. Young jack pine and black spruce. Dense, even-aged, normal post-fire succession. But in the middle of the regeneration I found them. Young black spruce, maybe 15 years old, arranged in a perfect circle. 20 meters in diameter. Perfect spacing. Already leaning inward slightly. The center was clearing itself, no undergrowth, no competing vegetation. Just bare ground and moss. This was a circle in early formation. And according to Protocol 7, I needed to document it and leave immediately. I took photos from outside. Marked GPS coordinates. Note the diameter and tree spacing. But I also noticed something else. The trees were too uniform. Young spruce and natural regeneration show variation, different heights, different growth rates, different positions based on where seeds happen to land. But these were identical. Same height, same diameter, same distance apart. Like they'd been planted, or arranged, or grown according to a template that had nothing to do with natural seed dispersal. I reported it to my supervisor that evening. He was concerned. That's the youngest forming circle we've documented. Usually we don't see the pattern until trees are at least 30 years old. If it's showing geometric growth at 15 years. He paused. Dana, I need you to stay away from that area. Don't survey near it again this season. Actually, I'm pulling you back. Your survey work is done for the year. Come back to the district office. We need to discuss this. I spent October at the district office, reviewing data, meeting with my supervisor and the regional forester. They showed me records I hadn't seen before. Historical records. The circles had been documented since the 1920s. Early forestry surveys mentioned them, called them peculiar growth formations or anomalous regeneration patterns. In the 1950s, a university researcher tried to study them, spent 3 summers documenting circles, published one paper describing them as potentially organized by subsurface fungal networks or response to localized soil chemistry. But his final summer, he'd gone missing. His vehicle was found at a trailhead, his equipment scattered across 3 kilometers of forest. He was found 4 days later, alive but unresponsive. He couldn't speak about what happened, couldn't work in forests anymore. Eventually moved to Alberta and worked in grassland ecology instead. The ministry had been aware of the circles for decades, had protocols since the 1970s, but they'd never publicized it, never shared the information beyond internal use. Because how do you explain to the public that vast sections of crown forest contain geometric growth patterns that affect human consciousness? Do trees grow in ways that violate ecology? Do foresters who study the patterns too closely disappear or have breakdowns? You don't. You just develop protocols. You train your staff. You warn them. And you hope they follow the rules. In November, I requested to see the primary site. My supervisor refused. It's not safe. Even with protocols, even with a team, that site is where the phenomenon is strongest. We don't send anyone there anymore. The last survey was in 2004. 2 technicians went in with full safety protocols. They documented the site for exactly 28 minutes as per protocol. When they came out, both reported that it felt like hours had passed. Both quit within a month. One still has nightmares about it. What's at the primary site? What makes it different? He pulled out a file. Aerial photos. The primary site was massive, a circle nearly 200 meters in diameter. But inside that circle were more circles, smaller ones, nested, creating a geometric pattern that looked almost mandala-like from above. The trees forming the patterns were ancient. Some are over 100 years old, meaning the pattern had been growing for at least a century. And in the very center, where all the circles converged, was something the photos couldn't quite show. The center was too dark, too distorted, like the camera couldn't focus on it properly. We don't know what's at the center, my supervisor said. Every attempt to reach it has failed. The spatial distortion becomes too severe. People can't navigate properly. They walk in circles. Time becomes completely unreliable. The longest anyone's lasted inside the primary site is 45 minutes. And they only made it 30 meters from the perimeter before having to turn back. In December, I made a decision. I've been thinking about James McKay, about his notebook, about how he'd written that the circle was closing, that the trees were moving. I needed to understand what was really happening, what the circles were, why they affected people. So I lied, told my supervisor I was going home to Sault Ste. Marie for the holidays. Instead, I drove north, back to my territory, back to the primary site. I reached the area on December 18th, winter in the Boreal forest. Deep snow, extreme cold, but also clarity. You can see farther in winter. The leafless deciduous trees don't block sight lines. I followed old GPS coordinates, hiking in on snowshoes. It took 6 hours to reach the primary site. And when I saw it, I understood why protocols existed. The circles were massive, visible from a distance. The geometric pattern is obvious even through winter forest. Black spruce arranged in perfect rings. Multiple rings nested inside each other, all leaning inward, all pointing toward the center. And the center itself was wrong. Not dark because of the shadow, dark because light didn't behave properly there. It bent, wavered, like heat distortion but in winter cold. And the silence was absolute. No wind sounds, no snow falling from branches, nothing, just oppressive, complete silence. I stood at the outer perimeter. Every instinct screamed to leave, but I'd come this far. I had to see. I checked my watch. 2:17 p.m. I had maybe 90 minutes before the 4 p.m. cutoff in Protocol 2. I could document the outer rings, take measurements, try to understand the pattern. I set a timer on my phone. 30 minutes. That's all. Then I'd leave whether I'd finished or not. I entered the outer ring. Immediately something changed. The temperature felt different. Not colder, just different. Like the air had texture. Wait, my footsteps sounded wrong. Muffled. Like the snow was absorbing sound completely. I took photos, measured tree spacing, documented the pattern, but I also felt it. A pull. Subtle. Like gravity was slightly stronger toward the center. Like something was pulling at me. Not physically. Something deeper. Like my attention was being drawn. Like I wanted to go deeper. To see what was at the center. To understand. I checked my timer. 15 minutes had passed. Good. I was halfway through my documentation. I moved to the second ring. The pull was stronger here. The light was dimmer. And I started hearing it. A sound. Like creaking. But rhythmic. Regular. Like breathing. Like the trees were breathing. I knew I should leave. Protocol 4 was explicit. If you hear sounds, evacuate. But I was so close. Just a few more measurements. Just a few more photos. I could finish this. I could be the first to properly document the primary site. My timer alarm went off. 30 minutes. Time to leave. I looked at my watch. 2:47 p.m. Good. Right on schedule. I turned to go. But I couldn't remember which direction I'd come from. The trees all looked the same. The circles disoriented me. I pulled out my GPS. It showed my location. But when I tried to navigate back to my entry point, the arrow spun. Couldn't lock direction. I tried my compass. The needle wavered. Wouldn't settle. I was lost. Inside a circle. With darkness approaching. And I just violated multiple protocols. Panic set in. I forced it down. Followed training. When lost, stay put. But I couldn't stay here. Not after dark. Not inside the primary site. I picked a direction. I walked straight, keeping the sun position constant. After 20 minutes, I reached the outer perimeter. Found my snowshoe tracks. Followed them out. When I finally cleared the circle completely, I checked my watch. 4:52 p.m. But that was impossible. My timer had gone off at 2:47 p.m. And I'd only walked maybe 40 minutes since then. But according to my watch, over 2 hours had passed. Just like the other incidents. Time distortion. Real. Measurable. Impossible. I didn't stop. Hiked back to my truck. Drove south. I didn't stop driving until I was back in Thunder Bay. I spent 3 days in a hotel, reviewing my photos, reviewing my data, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. The photos showed the circles clearly, the geometric perfection, the nested pattern, but the photos of the center were distorted, blurred, like the camera couldn't focus, like something about that central space defied recording. I called my supervisor, confessed what I'd done. He was quiet for a long time. You violated protocol. You went alone. You spent more than 30 minutes inside. You experienced time distortion. Another pause. But you got out. And you're okay. That's more than James managed. More than some others. The question now is, can you still do this work? Or has the primary site affected you too much? I didn't know. I felt fine. But I also felt changed. Like I'd seen something I couldn't unsee. Like I'd been touched by something I couldn't explain. The circles were real. They were active. They affected space and time. They affected human consciousness. And they were growing. The forming circle I'd found proved that. New circles were appearing. The pattern was expanding. And no one knew what it meant. No one knew what the circles were. Or what they wanted. Or why they existed. I took a month off. January. I tried to decide if I could continue forestry work. I tried to process what I'd experienced. But I also kept researching. Looking for historical records. Indigenous knowledge. Anything that might explain the circles. I found references in Ojibwe oral histories. Stories about places in the forest where the trees stood guard. Where the forest remembered. Where people shouldn't go because the old things still lived there. The stories went back centuries. Long before European settlement. The circles had been there all along. The forest had always grown this way. We just started noticing it when we began systematic surveys. I returned to work in February, but I requested a different territory. Southern Ontario. Managed forests. Areas with heavy recreation use. Places without circles. My supervisor approved the transfer. Said he understood. Said most people couldn't continue working after experiencing the primary site. Said I'd lasted longer than most. But I also did something else. I compiled everything I knew. Every incident report. Every protocol. Every observation. I wrote it down. Organized it. Created a comprehensive document. Not official. Just information. For the next technician who'd be assigned my old territory. For the next person who'd encounter the circles. So they'd know. So they'd understand. So they'd follow the protocols and not end up like James McKay. Not end up lost in a geometric pattern of trees that bend time and space. Not end up touched by something older than the forest itself. I'm still a forest technician. I still work for the ministry. But I work in places where trees grow randomly now. Where forests develop through normal ecological processes. Where the patterns I see can be explained by science. I don't work in the Boreal forest anymore. Don't work in northwestern Ontario. Don't survey areas where black spruce grows in perfect circles with cleared centers, and that pull at your attention and distort time. But I think about it. About the circles. About what they are. About why they exist. The ministry has no answers. The scientific community doesn't acknowledge them. They're too strange. Too impossible. So they remain documented but unexplained. Surveyed but not understood. Avoided but not eliminated. Sometimes I wonder if they're still growing. If that forming circle I found is larger now. If the primary site has expanded. If more technicians have encountered them. If anyone else has been stupid enough to go in alone. If anyone else has felt that pull. That draws toward the center. That needs to understand what's creating these patterns in the forest. The trees are growing in circles. They've been doing it for at least a century. Probably much longer. And they'll keep doing it. Because whatever is causing it, whatever intelligence or force or ancient thing exists in that forest, it's patient. It's been there longer than us. It'll be there longer than us. And all we can do is document it. Create protocols. Warn people. And hope they're smart enough to follow the rules. Smart enough to take measurements and leave. Smart enough not to stay after dark. smart enough not to try to reach the center, because the circles are real. They're active. They're growing. And people who don't respect them disappear. Or worse, they come back changed. Come back unable to work in forests. Come back with lost time and memories of trees that move in circles that pulse and a pulling sensation that never quite leaves. I followed the protocols. Eventually, after violating them, after experiencing what James McKay experienced, after feeling the pull and the distortion and the impossibility of it all, I got out. I survived. I transferred. And I'll never go back. Never survey those areas again. Never risk that pull. That draws toward understanding something that humans aren't meant to understand. I returned to work in February, but I requested a different territory. Southern Ontario. Managed forests. Areas with heavy recreation use. Places without circles. My supervisor approved the transfer. Said he understood. Said most people couldn't continue working after experiencing the primary site. Said I'd lasted longer than most. But I also did something else. I compiled everything I knew. Every incident report. Every protocol. Every observation. I wrote it down. Organized it. Created a comprehensive document. Not official. Just information. For the next technician who'd be assigned my old territory. For the next person who'd encounter the circles. So they'd know. So they'd understand. So they'd follow the protocols and not end up like James McKay. Not end up lost in a geometric pattern of trees that bend time and space. Not end up touched by something older than the forest itself. I'm still a forest technician. I still work for the ministry. But I work in places where trees grow randomly now, where forests develop through normal ecological processes, where the patterns I see can be explained by science. I don't work in the Boreal forest anymore. Don't work in northwestern Ontario. Don't survey areas where black spruce grows in perfect circles with cleared centers and that pull at your attention and distort time. But I think about it, about the circles, about what they are, about why they exist. The ministry has no answers. The scientific community doesn't acknowledge them. They're too strange, too impossible. So they remain documented but unexplained, surveyed but not understood, avoided but not eliminated. Sometimes I wonder if they're still growing, if that forming circle I found is larger now, if the primary site has expanded, if more technicians have encountered them, if anyone else has been stupid enough to go in alone, if anyone else has felt that pull, that draws toward the center, that needs to understand what's creating these patterns in the forest. The trees are growing in circles. They've been doing it for at least a century, probably much longer, and they'll keep doing it. Because whatever is causing it, whatever intelligence or force or ancient thing exists in that forest, it's patient. It's been there longer than us. It'll be there longer than us. And all we can do is document it, create protocols, warn people, and hope they're smart enough to follow the rules. Smart enough to take measurements and leave. Smart enough not to stay after dark. Smart enough not to try to reach the center. Because the circles are real. They're active. They're growing. And people who don't respect them disappear. Or worse, they come back changed. Come back unable to work in forests. Come back with lost time and memories of trees that move in circles that pulse and a pulling sensation that never quite leaves. I followed the protocols. Eventually, after violating them, after experiencing what James McKay experienced, after feeling the pull and the distortion and the impossibility of it all, I got out. I survived. I transferred. And I'll never go back. Never survey those areas again. Never risk that pull. That draws toward understanding something that humans aren't meant to understand.